When Israel received the old law, God was giving them a great privilege. Because at the time, he was not ready to do everything that he ultimately had in his plan. Or should I say, we were not ready for that. Mankind needed some guidance. We needed to be brought to a certain point before the ultimate culmination of God's plan in Jesus would be accomplished. So therefore, those who had access to that law had a great privilege because they had a little more of a peek behind the curtain than some others living at the time. Of course, that didn't mean that they took advantage of that. In fact, we see many times throughout Israel's history, even though they had access to this knowledge, to this understanding of at least what was revealed up to that point in the old law, even though God would be doing something amazing, he would be doing something incredible in the future, they did not always recognize what that meant for them in the present. In fact, we see times where God would have something coming on the horizon. He would send his people, men of God, sending them out there to warn people of what was coming, to alert them to what was coming. And many would not listen. As those who were sent out to proclaim a message from God, as they spoke, as they were with people day in and day out, many of those who should have known, should have recognized, should have seen what was coming, didn't. But some who, by all accounts, were at a disadvantage. Some who, by all accounts, should not have known, if you will, still knew enough. As Paul says in Romans, all have the opportunity through the things that are made to know of God. They knew enough to listen to the men of God who they heard, to pay attention to what was coming. We have an example of that in the Ethiopian eunuch, who encounters a man of God, and unlike many around him, listens to what he has to say. Now, you might be thinking in your minds, as we talk about an Ethiopian eunuch, of a chariot and a scroll of Isaiah and a man named Philip and a body of water. But actually, our story begins several centuries before that. This is during the reign of Zedekiah, the king of Judah. As Zedekiah is ruling over Judah, there is a man of God, not named Philip, but named Jeremiah. This man of God is proclaiming that something is coming. In this case, it's not a message of hope, at least not directly. It is a message of warning. God has decreed, because of your sins, Israel, because you have not listened to what you had in front of you, you have not paid attention to what God has revealed, God has decreed that you will be destroyed by the rising force in the east, Nebuchadnezzar, and the armies of Babylon. Jeremiah proclaims this message to God's people. He says, if, as the armies are approaching Jerusalem, if you will give yourself over, you will be spared. You will not be put to death. In fact, you will have your lives, as he describes it, as a spoil of war. But if you do not, what's coming is going to be very brutal indeed. Now, those in Zedekiah's council, if you will, they are not happy with this message that Jeremiah is proclaiming. This is the last thing you want, right? When you're under siege, you want morale to be boosted. You don't want someone going and saying, hey, give up, turn yourselves over to the enemy. That's treason, right? So they say, we need to put this guy to death. The king, even though he's the king, says, you know what, I can't stop you from doing whatever you want to do. So you take care of it. Thankfully, they don't just immediately put Jeremiah to death. Instead, they find a well. And they lower him down into this well. This well is not full of water. It has just enough moisture in there to where it's mud. And so we're told Jeremiah is lowered down to the well and he sinks down into the mud. And he's just left there to rot as the Israelites make their preparations to defend against Nebuchadnezzar's attack. And you might think this is it. This wouldn't be the first time, right, that a prophet of God has been killed for all intents and purposes, by those who would not listen, except for the Ethiopian eunuch. Because yes, there is an Ethiopian eunuch in this story, a man named Ebed-Melech. We're told his name, unlike the Ethiopian eunuch you might be more familiar with. Ebed-Melech hears of what has happened to Jeremiah. And he's a servant, he's serving in the court of the king. He approaches the king and he says, "This is wrong, this is evil, what has been done to Jeremiah. Your counselors have put him in this pit. He's going to die in there." The king does not seem to be a man of very much backbone, because just like he told his counselors, he now tells Ebed-Melech, do whatever you want, essentially. And so Ebed-Melech gets some of these other servants of the king, and they go to the well, and essentially, this is something from a movie, right? They get a bunch of rags and tie them together into a rope, and they lower it down into the well, and Jeremiah essentially puts it up under his armpit so that they can lift him out of the mud. Have you ever tried to pick up just like a foot out of the mud? Now imagine picking up a whole person, right? You need a lot of force to overcome the section of the mud. So they create this harness essentially, and they pull him out, and they're able to save his life. In the meantime, interestingly enough, the king then summons Jeremiah secretly. And he says, "I want you to tell me exactly what's going to happen. What is going to transpire? What is the word from the Lord?" And Jeremiah tells him very plainly, "If you turn yourself over to the Babylonians, you will be spared." That doesn't mean the city won't be given over to them. Obviously, that's going to happen no matter what. But if you turn yourself over, you will be spared, and much heartache and much bloodshed will be avoided. But if not, well, let's just say it won't be a pretty picture. The king sends him away, doesn't really respond favorably or unfavorably. In fact, you kind of get the sense, as we talked about a little bit in class, right, with the way the story is designed, you kind of almost get the sense of maybe he's going to make the right decision. And then you get to Jeremiah 39, and no, he's not. He tries to defend the city. Nebuchadnezzar shows up with his army. He lays siege, and ultimately a breach is made. The city is taken. The king tries to flee. Doesn't work. Just as Jeremiah predicted, the king is captured. His sons are executed before his eyes. Before his eyes are then removed. So the last sight that he ever sees are his children dying in front of him. If that gives you a sense of how the Babylonians treat those who resist. But Jeremiah is spared. Makes sense, right? The king, most likely, meaning Nebuchadnezzar, probably heard this guy was saying, "Surrender." I like that guy, right? For whatever reason, though, certainly providence is at play as well, Jeremiah is well treated once the Babylonians take over. And then God gives Jeremiah a message. Before Jeremiah will continue, meaning the book will continue on, going into other matters, we have this record of God telling Jeremiah, "I want you to go find Ebed-Melech, that Ethiopian eunuch who helped you. And I want you to let him know something, because now when everything's happening, people have been enslaved, all this is going on, well, he might be scared for his life. I want you to tell him, all these others, yes, they are going to suffer great things, but I'm going to spare your life. Ebed-Melech, the Lord says your life will be spared. You know why? Because you put your trust in me." What can we learn from the record of Ebed-Melech that we are given in Jeremiah chapter 38 and 39? Not a story I imagine we've read a whole lot. Not a book even that we read a whole lot, I imagine. Jeremiah can actually be pretty depressing, right? After all, he is called the weeping prophet for a reason, constantly begging the people of God to listen, and they won't. But let's talk for just a little bit about this character, this Ethiopian eunuch. Who was this individual? Well, first of all, as we think about who he was, we need to understand the reference, if you will, that we're given. We're told he is an Ethiopian eunuch who is in the king's house. Now, you're probably familiar in ancient times, many who would serve the king in the household of the king, in the palace, they would be eunuchs, and they would be oftentimes imported from other places. Such was the case in this. He is an Ethiopian. This is roughly the same place as the modern-day country, Ethiopia, down the eastern coast of Africa, about I don't know, a third of the way down from northern Africa. So he has been imported, if you will. I hate to use those words, but it's actually very likely he probably was, in some sense, a captive, whether it be a captive of war or a slave that was sold to eventually get to this point. So he's not an Israelite. Certainly not born into the people of God from an ethnic perspective. And he is simply a servant in the king's house. Now think about that for just a second. If everyone in the king's council, the king's cabinet, if you will, using modern day terminology, if everyone has a certain opinion, and they're the actual nobles, they're the Jewish, nobles of the time, and the king also goes along with it, what do you think it says if you try and go against the crowd? Do you think everyone else is going to say, oh, well, Ebed-Melech says that this is the way it should be, so as servants within the palace go, he is not exactly of a high rank. In fact, when you look at what we're told about Ethiopia in general, we actually go all the way back to Genesis and we learn something very interesting. So Cush is one of the ancient Hebrew references to the region that was later called Ethiopia. And we see that Cush, along with those of Egypt and Canaan and Put, are descendants of Ham. If you remember some of the language given to us in Genesis, we're told that there is going to be some conflict between the descendants of Shem and the descendants of Ham. And by this time, we certainly see that has played out in many ways. After all, who took Israel as slaves before they became their own nation? Egypt. What nations did they have to go to war with constantly throughout their time as they get out of Egypt and go to the promised land? Canaan. The point is, Ethiopia as well, and Put, by the way, would have been allies of Egypt, so kind of same thing there. Cush, or Ethiopia, would have been, maybe at least, regarded by Jews as a natural enemy. We're starting, hopefully, to get some Good Samaritan vibes here, right? Why on earth would an Ethiopian eunuch who is serving in the palace of the king, most likely not something he chose, not a life he wanted for himself, why would he care? Why would he put himself in this situation? Why would he stick his neck out for some guy who certainly seems like his time is done? If we want any more background into what his life might have looked like, when we kind of reverse the scales a little bit, we see that Daniel and his three friends, whether you know them by their Babylonian or their Hebrew names, they are also put in a very similar situation to what Ebed-Melech is at this time. They were also made eunuchs. They were also taken captive. They were also put in another king's court. Very similar. So when we think about who this man was, what we know is pretty simple. He was a foreigner, not an Israelite. He was from a pagan land, not a land that in any way followed the ways of God. And he served in Zedekiah's court. Probably, if we put all the pieces together, both historically and from the text, probably not something he chose, probably against his will. So why? Why would such an individual choose to intervene? Why did Ebed-Melech see this random person, from anyone else's perspective, who fell into the poor favor of those that were powerful in Jerusalem and say, I need to do something. I need to save that man's life. We're told that immediately when he hears, he goes to the king's house and says, this is wrong. Notice how he says it too. He says, my lord the king, these men have done evil. He didn't just say, hey, do you want me to maybe just get this guy out? I mean, it's not really going to be that big a deal whether he lives or dies, just kind of soften the blow. No, he very directly accuses the other nobles. They have done evil concerning this man. Why do that? Well, we don't have a whole lot of information about this character, but we are told something. We're told the reason why ultimately God rewards him, aren't we? As we mentioned a few moments ago, Jeremiah is told by God to tell Ebed-Melech the reason he will be spared is because you have put your trust in me. Do you realize the implications of that? He's a pagan. He's a pagan who probably doesn't want to be in the land of Israel. Now, sometimes if you are a servant in the household of a foreign nation, you are essentially expected or even forced to convert to their religion. So there might certainly have been many servants within the realm of Israel who they went through the motions, right, of following the old law. But going through the motions does not equate to sticking your neck out. This is not a man who simply had, at face value, converted to the worship of Yahweh according to the Jewish law. This is a man who truly had faith, as God himself recognizes. He heard the truth, and he listened. Now think about that compared to the rest of Israel. By that point, they had also heard the truth. In fact, they had had opportunities to hear the truth for generations. This was not only something they had heard, this was part of their culture, or at least it was designed to be. It's part of their everyday life. Constant reminders everywhere based on the law of who God was, of what he expected, of what he had done for them. And yet, who listens to the message of God and who doesn't? The one who listened was a foreigner who had no reason, if you will, from a human perspective, to listen, to pay attention, to do anything about it. But he did. That's where we come to the passage we read a few moments ago. When Jesus is going about in his ministry, once again, many did not listen to him. Many who had been prepared for his coming, many who were told, this is about to happen. And Jesus makes the point as he sees those who should have recognized and obeyed him ignore and ridicule and reject him. He says, this is nothing new. The same thing happened many times. Elisha didn't heal a lot of Israelite lepers, but he did heal Naaman, a pagan, a Syrian, an enemy historically of Israel. When Elijah goes and is helping out a widow, he doesn't help a Jewish widow, he helps out the widow of Zarephath. Why? Because they are demonstrating faithfulness. Although he may have been a foreigner, what we see in this record in Jeremiah 38 and 39 is that this foreigner, he had more faith than most of the Israelites of his day. You want to talk about a statement that would make the Israelites of the day bristle. We see that in Jesus' day. You remember what happens after he says, Elisha went to Naaman, Elijah went to the widow of Zarephath? That's when they try and throw him off a cliff. That's that story. Why? Because that's offensive. We are the ones who have the right to God. We are the ones who have access, have all this knowledge. That's our birthright as Jews. How dare you say someone else has more faith than us? And yet, what does God say as he is choosing the next king after Saul is such a disappointment? Man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks here. So as we consider the aftermath of our story this morning, we're told something bad does indeed happen. As we mentioned, the city is taken. Nebuchadnezzar does destroy not only the city, but even the temple. God allows that because of how bad the sin has gotten in Israel. We're told in 2 Chronicles, he, that is God, brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, that would be Nebuchadnezzar, who killed their young men with a sword in the house of their sanctuary and had no compassion on young men or virgin, old man or aged. And we might say, how could God do such a thing? Because they abandoned him. He had done so much. Not so much. He had done everything. And they spat in his face. And this is not some vengeance project on God's part. This is an attempt, if we see it from God's perspective, to help them change course. Faithfulness was not at a high point in the events and the days of Jeremiah. And yet what happens? God again says to Ebed-Melech, this foreigner, I will deliver you on that day, declares Yahweh. You will not be given into the hands of the men of whom you are afraid. I'd be afraid if I was in his position. But God says you don't have to be, because I see you. I see your faithfulness. In the midst of an unfaithful people, I see who you have chosen to follow, who you have chosen to become. Why do you think this is recorded in the book of Jeremiah? Would the main concepts that we need to learn in Jeremiah be perfectly present without this account recorded for us? Do we really need to know this? I mean, yeah, most of the information we need doesn't really involve Ebed-Melech, right? So why is it here? I would argue that the Holy Spirit put it here for that exact purpose, to show us that God does not forget faithfulness. When he sees someone who responds with obedience, with a heart that submits, even if it's not someone that we might expect, even if it's someone that we might just assume would never respond in such a way, God looks at the heart. God sees faithfulness. In the last book of the Bible, as Jesus is addressing letters to churches in the province of Asia that are struggling in various ways, he tells one of the churches, one who is actually doing well in terms of their spiritual life, but is about to face great persecution. He says, be faithful unto death. Even if it might cost you your life. It certainly might have cost Ebed-Melech his life in the decisions he made. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. God does not forget faithfulness. Even when everyone around you chooses not to be true to God. You have a choice as an individual. Each of us has a choice as an individual. Am I going to follow the crowd to do evil? Or am I going to be faithful? One of the beauties of the church is that if it's functioning as God designed, we are all working towards that goal. That's the way it should be. But that still remains to each one of us as individuals. God will see our faithfulness. But that's something that is on the responsibility of each one of our decisions. The people of Judah in Ebed-Melech's day were destroyed for their unfaithfulness. But he was the exception. Jeremiah, of course, was also an exception, but this is meant to highlight him. A foreigner, someone who was not of the lineage of Israel, who nevertheless was delivered by Israel's God, right? But except he's not Israel's God, only is he. Even during the time of the old law, he was the God of all creation, of all the created. Centuries later, there would be another Ethiopian eunuch. Once again, a foreigner, one who would not expect to follow God. And yet he, who knows why, who knows what connections he might have had, he had learned about the old law. He made it a habit to travel to Jerusalem to worship. And on this particular occasion, as he arrives in Jerusalem, there's a different teaching going around that he is trying to figure out. He begins reading through the scroll of Isaiah, trying to understand what is being said about this coming one. And even as many ethnic Jews who should have known better were rejecting the Messiah, this Ethiopian eunuch also finds his life overlapping with a man of God. And just like his predecessor before him, he too chooses to listen, chooses to be faithful. The Ethiopian eunuch, or should we say eunuchs, both of them, are powerful reminders for us that faithfulness is what really matters. Yes, I might call myself a Christian. Yes, I might go through the motions. God sees my heart. And I might look at someone and say, there's no way they would ever obey. They're too sinful. They're too removed. They didn't grow up in a Christian environment. Whatever we might say, whatever we might think, even if it's subconsciously. And yet we have to remember that God looks here. And friends, that's where my focus should be too, both on myself and on others. God looks at my heart. Where is your heart this morning? When he looks there, will he see faithfulness? Or will he see someone who is relying on their birthright, on what they have done externally, the appearance that they have presented? That's not what God cares about. Are there things he commands that we do? Absolutely. Are there things he requires us to do? Absolutely. But if the heart is not right, then in vain do we worship. Where is your heart this morning? I hope your heart is like that of the Ethiopian eunuch. Someone who is interested in being faithful, no matter what those around you choose to do. And if we can help you as you strive to remain faithful to our God, we want to do so. That's what we all as a group are trying to do together. And God has given us one another to help us in that goal. If we can help you, please let us know as we stand and sing together.